The call came in just after dawn. The aquarium was a quiet place in the early morning, the kind of serene you'd expect from a building full of glass tanks and softly burbling water. That serenity cracked the moment I stepped into the main exhibit hall. "Detective Alec Monroe," I said, flashing my badge at the uniformed officer by the entrance. She nodded, her face pale as she gestured me inside. The tank in question was the centerpiece of the building, a massive cylindrical structure housing dozens of vibrant reef fish, rays gliding like ghosts among the coral. The water shimmered under the artificial lights, but no one was looking at the fish. All eyes were on the body floating face down at the surface. The victim, Dr. Naomi Lark, was one of the aquarium's senior marine biologists. She was well known in her field, often quoted in articles about ocean conservation and a regular guest on local news segments. Seeing her like this, her body limp, dark hair fanning out like seaweed, was jarring. "Who found her?" I asked, pulling on a pair of gloves as I approached the edge of the tank. "A maintenance worker," the officer replied. "Came in to check the filtration system around 6. He's in the break room, shook up pretty bad." I nodded, crouching down to get a better look. The coroner, Dr. Elena Park, was already there, her expression grim as she examined the scene. "Morning, Monroe," she said without looking up. "Morning. What do we have?" She gestured to the body. "Obvious signs of drowning, but there's bruising around the wrists and a nasty bump on the back of her head. My guess? She was unconscious when she went into the water. Staged to look like an accident? That's my read. I'll know more once we get her on the table." I stood, scanning the area. The tank was surrounded by a low railing, meant to keep visitors from leaning too far over. A narrow maintenance ladder led up to an access hatch at the top. It didn't take a genius to see how someone could have shoved her in and closed the hatch behind them. "Do we have security footage?" "Not for this part of the exhibit," the officer said. "The cameras focus on the entrances and the gift shop." "Convenient," I muttered. As I walked around the tank, something caught my eye, a small smear of blood on the railing. It was faint, nearly missed under the dim lighting, but it was there. "Get CSU to swab this," I said, pointing it out, "and let's seal off this area. I don't want anyone contaminating the scene." The officer nodded and moved to relay the orders. I turned back to Dr. Park. "Anything else I should know?" She hesitated, then said, "There's something odd. The victim has salt water in her lungs, which makes sense given the tank. But I'm picking up traces of something else, some kind of chemical. I'll need to run tests. Let me know as soon as you have results." Leaving the coroner to her work, I headed to the break room to speak with the maintenance worker. He was a wiry guy in his late 40s, his hands trembling as he gripped a cup of coffee. His name tag read Marco. "Mr. Ortiz," I said, taking a seat across from him. "I'm Detective Monroe. I understand you're the one who found Dr. Lark." He nodded, eyes darting to the table. "Yeah, I thought she was cleaning the tank or something at first, but when I called out to her, she didn't move. That's when I ran to get help." "Did you see or hear anything unusual before that? Any strangers in the building? Arguments?" "No, but, there's been tension lately. Between Dr. Lark and some of the other staff." "What kind of tension?" Marco hesitated, lowering his voice. "She was pushing for changes, big ones, cutting back on certain exhibits, reallocating funds for conservation projects. A lot of people weren't happy about it." "Anyone in particular?" He hesitated again, then said, Maybe talk to Roger Lynn. He's the curator." They didn't exactly get along. I made a note of the name, thanking Marco for his time before heading out. The aquarium's offices were tucked away on the second floor, a maze of narrow hallways and buzzing fluorescent lights. Roger Lynn's door was marked with a neatly printed nameplate. I knocked. The man who opened the door was in his mid-30s, with sharp features and a tailored suit that looked out of place among the casual attire of the other staff. His smile was polite, but didn't reach his eyes. "Detective Monroe," I said, offering my hand. "I'm investigating Dr. Lark's death. Do you have a moment?" He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The office was immaculate, every paper and pen in its place. A large photograph of an open ocean hung on the wall behind his desk. "This is a terrible tragedy," he said as we Saturday. Naomi was a brilliant scientist. I've heard there were some disagreements between you two. His expression tightened. Professional disagreements. Nothing more. Can you elaborate? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Naomi was passionate about conservation, sometimes overly so. She wanted to cut funding to exhibits that she deemed less critical to our mission. It's not that I disagreed with her goals, but we have a business to run. Guests come to see sharks and jellyfish, not grant proposals. Did those disagreements ever get heated? Not particularly. We debated, but it was always professional. Did you see her last night? He shook his head. No. I left around 7. As far as I know, she was still working. I studied him for a moment, then stood. Thank you for your time, Mr. Lin. I may have more questions later. He nodded, his polite smile returning as he showed me out. As I made my way back to the exhibit hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface of this case. Just like the tranquil waters of the tank where Naomi Lark had met her end. Back in the exhibit hall, the CSU team was already at work, carefully swabbing the blood on the railing and dusting for prints. The quiet hum of their work filled the space, mingling with the low gurgle of water filters. I stood by the tank, staring into the artificial reef, where rays drifted lazily and fish darted in and out of coral crevices. Something didn't sit right. Marco's hesitation when mentioning Roger Lin, Lin's overly polished demeanor, and that faint chemical trace in Naomi's lungs. It felt like a puzzle with too many pieces missing. Detective, one of the CSU techs called, interrupting my thoughts. Found something. I walked over to where she was crouched near the base of the tank, holding up a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a broken fragment of a pair of glasses. Looks like someone lost these in the struggle, she said. They were wedged under the railing. I frowned, taking the bag. Naomi didn't wear glasses, at least not in any of the photos I'd seen of her. Run it for prints, I said. Let's see if we can get an ID. As the tech nodded and went back to work, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Dr. Park. I've got preliminary results on that chemical, she said. It's a sedative, sodium thiopental. Not enough to knock someone out completely, but definitely enough to make them woozy and disoriented. So Naomi had been drugged before she hit her head. Could it have been ingested? I asked. Possibly. But given the levels, I'd say it's more likely it was injected. I glanced at the body, still floating in the tank. Any signs of a needle mark? Not that I've found yet, but I'll keep looking. Thanks, Elena. Let me know if anything else turns up. As I hung up, the pieces started to shift into place. Whoever had done this had been methodical, drugging Naomi, staging the scene to look like an accident. But methodical didn't mean perfect. People always made mistakes. I stepped back from the tank and scanned the room again, my eyes lingering on the ladder leading to the access hatch. If Naomi had been injected, the killer would have needed a moment to do it, long enough for someone to potentially see or hear them. Detective Monroe? The officer who'd been stationed at the door approached me, holding a clipboard. I've got the staff schedules from last night. Dr. Lark was one of 3 people still in the building after hours. Who were the others? Roger Lin and a junior aquarist, Emily Greer. She clocked out just before 10. Emily Greer. Another name to add to the list. Where's Emily now? She's in the break room. I headed in that direction, finding Emily perched on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly around a water bottle. She was in her early 20s, her brown hair pulled back into a ponytail, her expression tense. Emily, I said, sitting down across from her. I'm Detective Monroe. I understand you were working last night. She nodded, her voice shaky. I didn't see anything. I was in the back, working on some reports. Did you interact with Dr. Lark at all? Not really. She came in to grab some files from her office, but she didn't stay long. She seemed distracted. Distracted how? Emily hesitated, then said. She looked upset, like she'd been crying. That was new. Did she say anything to you? No. She just grabbed her stuff and left. I didn't think much of it. Do you know if she had any conflicts with anyone here? Emily bit her lip, looking away. It's not my place to say. I'm not asking you to take sides, I said gently. But anything you can tell me might help. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. She and Roger, they argued a lot. He didn't like her ideas, and she didn't like his priorities. But it wasn't just him. Some of the other staff weren't happy with her either. They thought she was too pushy. Anyone in particular? There's Sarah Drake. She's the head of the education department. She and Naomi clashed over funding for programs. I made a mental note of the name. Thank you, Emily. If you think of anything else, give me a call. As I left the break room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was about more than just professional disagreements. Greed and jealousy had a way of festering, even in places that seemed as serene as an aquarium. The question was, who had enough to gain, or enough to lose, to resort to murder? I spent the rest of the day piecing together the puzzle, combing through statements, and waiting on lab results. By late afternoon, the evidence started to align, painting a picture that was equal parts tragic and infuriating. The fragment of glasses found at the scene matched a pair belonging to Roger Lynn. When questioned, he admitted he had been near the tank, but claimed it was purely coincidental. I went to check on the exhibit after hours, he said, his tone defensive. Naomi wasn't there when I left, but the lab results told a different story. The sedative in Naomi's system? It matched a vial found in Roger's office, hastily stashed in the bottom drawer of his desk. And that faint smear of blood on the railing? A match for his DNA. When confronted, Roger cracked under pressure, the carefully composed facade crumbling. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he blurted out, pacing the interrogation room. She wouldn't listen. She was going to ruin everything we built here. Roger's motive was as clear as the water in the tanks he cared so much about. Naomi had pushed for funding cuts that threatened his prized exhibits. He saw her as an obstacle, a threat to the aquarium's future and his career. In a moment of desperation, he lured her to the exhibit hall, drugged her, and staged the scene to look like an accident. But he underestimated Naomi's resilience. She had clawed at the railing before being pushed in, leaving behind that crucial smear of blood. And his haste in staging the scene left enough clues to lead us straight to him. The next morning, I returned to the aquarium, now eerily quiet in the wake of the crime. The main exhibit hall was closed to the public, the tanks dimmed in mourning. As I stood before the tank where Naomi had died, I thought about her passion for conservation, her drive to make a difference. She'd fought for what she believed in, even when it made her enemies. Justice is served, Dr. Lark, I murmured, the shimmering water casting ripples of light across my face. The serenity of the aquarium was deceptive, just like the people who worked there. Beneath the surface, there had been greed, jealousy, and ambition lurking in the depths. But now, at least, the waters were a little clearer.